we'll introduce. So we'll move right into it because we do have a lot to cover, and really want to thank everybody. Whether you're at your beach house or whether you're sitting in a truck or whether you are absolutely kind of just, bored to death because the summer did not turn out the way you anticipated. We're so thrilled that you're able to join us. And the format for this is a little bit different than we're used to having, but the theme also is a little bit updated from when we first put this forth. Hopefully you'll bear with us as we go through it. First of all, I'm Durham Wong-Rieger, the President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, and we are really pleased to be able to host this series of webinars. This comes at a time in which we're being brought back to consider, the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board, and we won't go through the entire series of webinars that we've had, but for those of you who've been participating with us, you know that we've had at least 6, 7, 8 webinars that have been really focused around what the proposed in terms of guideline changes are and the impact of those, and especially in terms of the rare diseases community. And so now we wanted to make sure we have an opportunity for people to come back together, given the most recent July proposals for revised guidelines focusing on the gap in the grandfather medicines. But we thought it was a great opportunity, actually, not just to focus on that, because those are very targeted kinds of proposals which do need to be addressed, but we felt that it was a great opportunity to just go all the way back to say, what is it we're trying to do here? What is the purpose, or what was the purpose of the Patent Medicines Prices Report? And can we come back and reconsider, is that mandate, still legitimate? Have we wandered too far away from it? And really, what were the unintended consequences of some of those wanderings away? I actually would like to blame this entire session on Sheila Fromm. I mean, I'm so glad that she's here, because I was having a conversation with Sheila, and actually I blame it on Wayne and Neil as well, because I mentioned to her, I said, we had Wayne and Neil both on a recent webinar that we're doing, and they really talked about, the role for the PMPRB, is there still a role for them, because, the original mandate in terms of the non-excessive pricing seems to have been, no longer necessary if we got others. And Sheila says, oh my gosh, she said, and I quote, they're just babies. They have no idea really in terms of the original mandate they came in way later. We have to go all the way back to 1987 when the PMPRB was first put in place and understand kind of what that mandate was, and really now come back to saying, okay, what should it, and what was its role? How well did it work? And where are we now, and what should be the role? So so as I say, I blame this on Sheila, Wayne, and Neil. So I'm glad that they're all here to help kind of get us out of this hole. So really for me, it was a little bit of an epiphany. I thought I knew kind of what I was talking about, and I realized I had no idea what I was talking about. And I thought it might be a great opportunity for many of those of us who were probably babies at that time and not really, as focused in terms of kind of what that original mandate was. And we thought we'd do a 2-part series, and this is the first part, to refocus the PMPRB back to the future, part 1, because as we look at it, there was and maybe still is a very legitimate role in terms of the PMPRB. But what is that role, and how do we get here? Next slide. Am I doing slides? No, you're doing slides. Somebody else. Okay, here we go. So I thought I'd just run you very quickly the history of the PMPRB, because we've got a great lineup in terms of participants, and I don't want to take away too much time for it. But I thought, and Bill thought it was okay for me to do it, because I come at it, with sort of a naivete, and, that maybe resonates more with the rest of our audience than those of you who have been really, well ensconced in both the legal aspects of it. So as you know, it was created in 1987 under the Patent Act. It had 2 roles at that time. One was regulatory, to ensure prices for patent medicines sold in Canada are not excessive. And that's the key word, they're not excessive. And secondly, to encourage, but to report primarily on pharmaceutical trends, R&D spending by the pharmaceutical patentees, and so that we can do appropriate policy making. not to belabor it, but and those of you who've been around will know that the amendments to the Patent Act helped Canada to kind of enter into the modern era in terms of regulations around the prices and the for patent medicines, and really was to protect, again, extend the intellectual property that was available in other jurisdictions, ensure that the industry was able to have benefits, promote Canada's multilateral relations, consumer protection, obviously, and to promote healthcare. Next. So out of it came Bill C-22. And if we look in, kind of the literature, it really was an exchange for extending the period of patent protection, before compulsory licensing could be possible. I mean, many of us, never really lived through the notion that we had compulsory pricing. And, so that was much later when it was actually kind of also dropped by the wayside. But established in that the PMPRB, the review board, and their job was to determine a maximum price, and it was going to be through a voluntary compliance agreement, so really a negotiation process. And again, the operative word is that the prices are not excessive, and also to report on the investment. So what was considered to be non-excessive pricing under that mandate? And then again, Wayne and Neil and many others would know a whole lot better than me, but when you look at it, okay, that's what it was. Prices, the way medicines are sold are, relative to the therapeutic class. That would be one benchmark. What are other drugs that are, in that therapeutic class being sold for in Canada? Secondly, what are the other drugs that are sold in other countries other than Canada? And again, that's where that original basket of 7 countries, and whether those were the right countries or not, that was the original, set of countries. Also, as the consumer price index changed, then the prices of the drugs ought to be able to fluctuate with that CPI, so that they would never be, far beyond kind of what the CPI is, and then the other factors. So it was a fairly straightforward kind of a assessment, non-excessive, other countries, therapeutic class, and hey, we kind of continue to gauge and to manage the increases in prices, or could be decreases, along with the CPI. Next. So did it do a good job? Well, I don't know. I mean, the PMPRB and certainly the Health Canada report said, or the federal government report said, yeah, we thought they were doing a reasonable job. If we look at the reports that came out between 1988 and 2003, with the PMPRB, prices went, from being 23% above the median price of those 7 even fairly high comparative countries to below the median in 1994. Some amendments were introduced in 93 to, kind of work with the CPI. And hey, if you look at this chart, that kind of lays kind of where the Canadian price index is, right? Very nicely from, if you look at that one line, and where it was relative to, the median international prices. So Canada remained, comfortably below, those median prices. And, during that entire period of time, and in fact, there was now and up until the time this chart ends, it was well below that price. So was it doing a good job? Well, it seemed to be doing what it was set out to do, right? Next slide. So what began to happen? Well, in the midst of that chart, as you just saw there, as far as I can tell, again, I wasn't paying that much attention to it at the time. There were some concerns that we were getting maybe not as much kind of results as we wanted. That the prices were certainly not excessive compared to the international medians, but that the PMPRB was not actually able to exercise any real control or even the reporting in terms of the R&D investment. So there were some concerns that the R&D investments were falling below the targeted of 10% to somewhat below that. But hey, we don't really have an idea in terms of how that was being reported to. It actually reflects, what is actually being spent. More importantly, though, if you look at least in the literature, there were some big environmental changes, and we all know that, right? So by this time, we're starting to see the end of these blockbuster drugs, these amazingly large class drugs, and we saw lower cost generics introduced. So the whole notion of keeping the patented prices, introductory prices, at a certain level, and even monitoring them became maybe less relevant because a lot of these drugs were actually being moved over into generics. And also, is the emergence at this time of what we call much more innovative, higher cost drugs, niche market drugs, and including the biologics, right? So these come in, they command a much higher individual pricing. Their overall impact in terms of the, drug spend may not have been that much, but, it became a concern that, hey, do the kinds of measures that we've got in the PMPRB, are they helping us in terms of ensuring that these prices are not excessive, only because they look so different than the prices for some of the past chemical drugs? And the other thing that happened, though, interestingly enough, was that instead of talking about are they excessive prices, introduction of the notion of what's the impact on our drug budgets. Now, I don't know if the PMPRB was ever intended to kind of, look at kind of what the provincial spend or the public spend or even the private spend was going to be in terms of drugs, because that can be influenced by a whole bunch of other things, as we all know, population, the offsets in terms of healthcare costs, et cetera, et cetera. But it became concerned that, okay, and maybe some complaints that we're not able to manage our drug budgets. They're increasing without necessarily sort of saying, okay, it's all due to the to these innovative or high price drugs that are coming in. But increasing globalization was introduced, so we're much more aware of what other countries are doing, how other countries are introducing drugs, and the fact that pharmaceutical companies are really kind of approaching this as a global market. Changes, which reduce price transparency, because we now have, lots of negotiated pricing. We have rebates, we have discounts that are not evident. So the list price of drugs, introductory price of drugs, maybe have a lot less relevance to kind of what the actual prices are being paid, but we don't know what those are. So the PMPRB, their ability to actually manage that is, at least in terms of the drug budgets and the drug spend, is not there. Now, was that ever their intent? We don't know. And as you can see here, patent medicine is still a small fraction. That was in 2019, the national health expenditure. They remain that so. And again, as we said, the concerns would be that the expenditures, are not clear because we have these non-transparent rebates, negotiated discounts. Next slide. So scoping paper 2017, I won't go into deep detail, though for me, it was a great opportunity to read it and to understand a bit more in terms of how we were making this transition. And those of you who've been in the industry and those of you following this is nothing new to you, but certainly was, for me, an interesting notion of how did we actually move into where we are? And, there was, sort of clearly laid out that, yes, the median of an international basket, but also the introduction of this notion of a therapeutic value, being introduced to the PMPRB, and that there would be some ability to do some priority, and that there would be different priorities in terms of drugs, and that this would be based on some notion of a ICER, a cost per quality, again, something brand new in terms of what the jurisdiction of the PMPRB was in terms of how these supposedly maximum list prices were being set, or what would be a non-excessive pricing. It was interesting, and I mean, I will have to say, in 2017, I didn't realize this was happening. And it had been laid out already in some significant detail. But the notion now was that not only were we going to change the basket, which was kind of easy to understand, but we're going to introduce in some kind of therapeutic value into what that price that could be charged is, and that we would do it on, the government would do it on, PMPR would do it on what the actual net pricing is, the pricing that would actually be paid. And this was, all of this, of course, was quite new, very different in terms of the mandate, and really, I think obviously raising a lot of alarms in terms of what the, not just the impact in terms of what the pricing would be on the industry, but, really some of the unintended consequences, which I think became clearer as many of us became more involved in terms of not just the regulations, but the guidelines. Next one. So, and also then an introduction of the notion that we could re-bench the ceiling prices on existing medicines. Again, somewhat new and somewhat different. So yes, we had an idea of what the maximum list price was. Yes, we have a CPI, but hey, we're going to re-bench those prices based on, kind of what new factors are, and that is the market size, market conditions, how much are you actually selling, how much you're actually making. So very different focus now all of a sudden, from us. We, and I will say personally, me got involved as well in 2019 when the PMPRB would be, prior to the passing of the regulations, set up a steering committee, supposedly to develop the guidelines for how these new regulations would be implemented. Many of us who were on that steering committee were extremely frustrated throughout the period of time. This is not my opportunity to re-vent on my frustrations in terms of the participation in the steering committee, but many of you have heard us say over and over again, and not just me, this was a steering committee that had no role in terms of steering. We were never given anything to steer with. I think at very best, we were getting flags that we could wave, and that was about as much steering as we got out of it. Very little change in terms of direction, very little change in terms of what those guidelines were going to be, and certainly not listening to what we've become increasingly clear is that the fallout on this, the unintended consequences of moving in this direction, we're going to have a tremendous impact in terms of certainly patient access to innovative therapies, and even in terms of some of those earlier steps in terms of clinical trials. So we won't go over this again. Those of you who've been part of our webinars, we've gone over this in many cases. Just to say, guidelines in 2019 for consultation, included in there, changing the comparative countries from 7 to new 11. That seems to be less controversial for many people in dropping the higher price comparators. But the concerns around the economic factors now really becoming clear, and the implementation of them laid out in a way that was, I would say in some respects, very scary for many of us, because even though the reference had originally been that CADTH would be, and maybe INES as well, would be the expert bodies that would actually be applying these economic factors in the way that they have been doing it, that in fact a lot of the control went into the PMPRB itself in terms of determining what are the priorities and what are the classes, how would these factors be applied, and at what point would we be looking at some changes even in terms of the prioritization. So this was quite challenging for many of us, because it seemed like not only a total change in terms of what the PMPRB mandate was all about, but also the implementation of this was going to be done by, not the one with no transparency. So even with CADTH and INES, we have, patient clinical input. We have the ability to see kind of how these decisions are being done. There's the ability to challenge them, to provide feedback. None of that was included in these guidelines. And that, of course, was a huge concern. And of course, the way in which they're going to be applied. And when we looked at the actual impact in terms of the negotiated prices, or what would have been negotiated prices, was going to be quite dramatic, far, greater than what we were, expecting, and certainly far greater than what was happening now. I mean, I said this morning, I was on a webinar, nobody objects to lower drug prices. Nobody objects to the fact that we would have better drug budgets. What we do object to is not recognizing that there has to be that delicate trade-off between, what we're paying for a drug, the investment in terms of the R&D, and the ability to get access to those drugs in a timely fashion when we're in a global environment, and quite frankly, not putting Canada at the very tail end of an access chain. And then very recently, as you all know, the introduction, 3 times the implementations was delayed. So that was interesting. Shift from July 1, 2020 to then the end of to January 2021. And now we're back to having to July, 2021, and now to be implemented January 1st, 2022. I don't know. Some of us feel like 3 strikes and you're out, but maybe that rule doesn't apply to the PMPRB. Anyway, in the midst of all this, we get introduced the change to the gap in grandfather medicines. We loosened July 15th, with the consultations now extended to August 2021, which prompted our hosting this at this point. Many of you will have seen, and we can go over again, the FAQs that the PMPR put out in terms of kind of what the impact of this was going to be. I think what hit many of us is quite startling was the fact that there would be a shift in existing medicines from their being benchmarked against what was previously agreed to the highest international comparator to the median international pricing. What does that really mean? And quite frankly, the question in terms of why they're being done now. And finally, the PMPRB communications plan. Some of us who was the patient groups were really at the eye of that storm and really felt that, some of the intentions of the PMPRB came really front and center, where there was internal communications, but also very much expressed externally of the role of the patient group community and the patient advocacy groups, including CORD, in terms of acting not so much in the good faith of the patients, but just acting on behalf of the industry. And I think this was something that really hit us very strongly. And in fact, was one of the reasons why we had commissioned Professor Donald Savoir out of Nova Scotia to actually write a paper for us, in which he really clearly expressed that the PMB, as a quasi-judicial agency, had a duty of neutrality, and they way overstepped that. And I think that becomes a real concern to us. How much can we trust you to be acting in terms of as a neutral arbiter, as opposed to having some very, very, specific kinds of positions that you're trying to advance. Next slide. Almost done. This is the whole series of legal actions that have been taking place. So 2011, I went back to Supreme Court, says, sure, PMPRB can actually have pricing over drugs that are sold under SAP and from outside of Canada. I think that was the famous Celgene case. June 2020, Federal Court of Canada. And in December 2020, 2 lawsuits that really challenged the jurisdiction of the PMPRB to be looking at economic factors. And federal court said, yes, that seemed to be within their mandate in terms of looking at excessive pricing to apply economic factors, but hey, they cannot actually command the reporting of those rebates, that is the commanding of the net prices. So it became a question of you may apply these, but you have no ability to actually know whether or not they are being met. So a little bit of an interesting challenge. December, the Quebec court also upheld the constitutionality. The question was whether or not they were acting outside of their role as the federal body, whereas this is really under the role of the provinces, who are actually the purchasers of the drugs. And again, the notion is you can apply these factors, but again, reinforcing the fact that your ability to actually get reports on what the actual sales price are beyond your scope. Both of these rulings are now under appeal. So just full disclosure, court is an intervener in both of those cases, and we remain so. And then July 29, 2021, very interesting Federal Court of Appeals. This is the case that had been going on with regard to the PMPRB and Alexion with regard to pricing of Soliris, a drug for cystinosis, which had been not cystinosis, for PNH, which had been challenged, and with the PMPRB asking them to roll it all the way back to the comparator, which is in fact a generic product. So challenges went through the court, and then the federal court upheld that, and the Federal Court of Appeal, to which it had been taken, said no. This is in fact an overstep, and that excessive pricing should in fact not be equated with unreasonable pricing. So the PMPRB has a role in terms of regulating what is considered to be excessive, but they cannot actually determine what should be reasonable. They didn't say what the price should be, but they said no, we were going to overturn the action against Alexion. And I think that's the kind of issue where we are now. Is excessive pricing the same as being able to command kind of what is a reasonable price from the perspective of payers, from the perspective of drug plans? Is there a role in terms of, as we see here, controlling patent abuse? But, and is that somewhat different? I mean, the consumer protection mandate is an important mandate, but the question is, how do you exercise it? And I would say, once again, from the perspective of the patients, we need to continue to have that delicate, exquisite balance between, we recognize that what we pay for in terms of drugs is not just kind of what the R&D is in terms of the drugs. We're paying for the drugs in order to ensure that there's continuing redevelopment of drugs, and it doesn't bear on the price of just one drug. But we also need to balance, what are we paying for the drugs? What is going to be the availability of those drugs in Canada? And yes, of course, we have to be concerned about, what it is that drug budgets can can afford, or at least are willing to pay. The willingness to pay is very different from what is an excessive price. And, so we as patients work a lot in terms of what's the willingness to pay and the investment that this represents. So I will leave it from there and turn it over to my co-host, Bill, who's going to take us through this all-star lineup and getting their take on this. So thank you very much for the opportunity to go through that little bit of a history.
Thanks so much, Durhan. And in fact, we've got, as you hinted earlier, some people who were part of and creating the history that you walked through. So we're going to actually get an opportunity for our expert panel to provide a little bit more color around that. And I think we've called this Back to the Future because there are some lessons learned around the history of the PMPRB and the turning point that we are now that may provide some spotlight or options for where to go next. You've asked me to go through two general questions, and we'll get there in a second. But I want to introduce our panel first. Unfortunately, Guillaume Couillard, the PMPRB director from 2014 till today, I understand he's co-leading or supporting in the leadership of PMPRB right now, was going to participate mainly to explain the situation around the current consultation. However, he had to decline participation earlier today because, as we discussed earlier, we're in the middle of a federal election and they cannot be out communicating in a public forum regarding an issue like this, at least in terms of how we're reviewing the issue. So I'm hoping that Guillaume or some of his colleagues are on the line and can participate that way. But we'll hopefully get you back maybe for part two or another time. Wayne Critchley with Global Public Affairs and past executive director of the PMPRB for a good 15 years is also with us. Wayne, thank you and welcome back. No stranger to CORD, former chair of CORD as well, as many of you know. Neil Palmer, principal with WN Palmer and Company. And he served in the earlier days as a PMPRB compliance and enforcement officer. But Wayne, Neil, many of us know you because of your global perspective on drug pricing. Few people can explain Germany, Italy, France, Sweden, as well as you can to Canada. So thank you for joining us once again here. Sheila Frame, we haven't seen you in a long time, and thank you for zooming in from Florida. But many people know Sheila as a leader and executive when you were in Canada, and you are still a proud Canadian, I'm sure, but you've been spending a lot of time in the US running significant operations within the pharmaceutical industry, and most recently with Amrit Pharma. But Sheila, you also have been active on LinkedIn, and that's, I think, where Durhan picked up on, your potential interest in coming back and sharing some of your experience, because you were there at the very beginning of this issue too. So thank you, Sheila. And we're looking forward to your review of what Canada looks like from the States, having been in some of these important roles in the early days of the PMPRB. We've got two legal experts with us as well. So the last slide that Durhan shared was about the legal cases that are currently underway. We've got Declan Hamill, Vice President of Policy, Regulatory and Legal Affairs with Innovative Medicines Canada. And thank you, Declan, for joining us. And we've got Maître Nicolas Rollo with Nicolas M. Rollo, Société Professionnelle, based in Toronto, a constitutional expert and really doing excellent work with CORD to support CORD's positions vis-a-vis, especially the constitutional case. But certainly, Nicolas, we had a chat a couple of days ago. You're keeping an eye on all of these different legal actions, the judicial reviews, plus the Alexion decision that happened recently. So we'll actually turn to our legal beagles on the line to pull some of the really key extracts from those cases. So what, and could they provide some guideposts for where next? And I'm the moderator of this. I'll direct traffic. Let's get started. we have two general questions that we wanted to put out, and this is for an open conversation. Please feel free to raise your hand, or if you jump in and we jump in too much, I'll have to like keep a speakers list. For the delegates on the line, use the chat group to please contribute. And I've already seen a couple of good messages, so thank you. And Neil, I got a note there that you have to leave at 2 o'clock sharp. Thank you for that. That heads up. I'll just pass that on to everybody. So the two general questions that Durhan wanted us to cover. One was about the PMPRB mandate and scope. We've talked a lot about how the operations of the PMPRB have shifted over the years and now are subject to some legal reviews. But let's talk about the PMPRB higher level mandate and scope. What is it meant to do? Has it accomplished that? And then the second question is actually about what are some alternatives to the current processes and operations that you might recommend. And I'm looking, Wayne, you wrote a great article called "A Fork in the Road," so we might actually put that in the chat group. Several of you have been pointing to some go forward ideas. I think we're going to start with you, Sheila, if that's okay. Can you share a bit about your perspective about how the PMPRB came to be? Get us started on this, given what Durhan said, and then feel free to jump in about mandate and scope in terms of the first questions for any panelist who wants to jump in. Sheila, over to you.
Thanks so much, everybody. And I see lots of good friends in the chat group. So it's great to see everybody. And it's always great to come back to Canada. I was up there actually just a few weeks ago. So I'm really happy to participate. And I guess, I feel like the old woman in the room here because I was the legislative assistant that took C-22 through the House and the Senate. I was even invited to seek my happiness off the bus in the middle of Regina with Tom Brogan, who many of you would know, when Senator Bonnell didn't like the fact that I was, talking to the media and they were getting some pretty tough questions about the entire rationale for why we were introducing patents at the time. So I'm definitely the oldest one in the room. And I think, when we first started talking about this, the scope of the PMPRB came at a time when we didn't have really great health economics. I mean, it was a very new, emerging profession, I'll call it now. And the provinces were not well set up at the time to really protect Canadians. And the second piece around R&D in Canada was really the intention. I mean, this was an industrial development policy to build off the strength of Canada's healthcare system and our education system. And if you think about it in that context, and now we're talking 35 years ago, and you look at where we are today, and the opportunity for Canada is massive in my view. I hope that it's not too late for Canada to come back with a really strong policy in terms of really a vision for industrial and economic development. But when I think about where we are today, we started the PMPRB with 26 FTEs. I think it gradually grew significantly more. And as I look back now, I think what a creation of bureaucratic creep in its worst situation, because now Canada's reputation in the world has declined significantly. So I guess as a passionate Canadian who has to argue for every cent that I get in investment, it's really tough right now because Canada's reputation is really not that great around the world. And most organizations from an R&D perspective really just kind of discount Canada. And you've seen the decline, not only in R&D as a percentage of sales, but you've also seen a decline in terms of the jobs that are being created and whether or not it's even worth launching a drug in Canada. And that scares me. So I think, I worry, and I don't want to disparage any of my colleagues on the panel, but let's say one of the biggest successes is the number of lawyers that we've created great careers from. Now, I also have had a great career because of the start that I got with the C-22 bill and the PMPRB, and I've had a great opportunity to impact a great many patients and certainly have lived and worked in Europe and the US and as well in Canada. So I guess my question back is, in today's context, does the federal government have a role to play in price, let's call it control, even though it's not constitutionally there? And secondly, why is it sitting in Health Canada? This board was always meant to stay under industrial policy as a way to keep the pharmaceutical industry, I'm going to say, accountable for its commitments. So while I sit back here and I will vote in this election because I can still vote in Canada, and I listen to all the debates around a national pharmacare program, I just have to ask the question, do we need it? What we actually need for Canada is an industrial strategy as it relates to maximizing the education system that we have and the healthcare system that we've built. We have world-class researchers in Canada, and we're missing that opportunity. So there you go. And it wasn't all my fault, Durhan. I'll just say that.
Thanks so much, Sheila. Wayne, I was going to go to you already. You got your hand up, so just go for it. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and thanks, Durhan. And thank you, Sheila. That was a great perspective that you provided to this. And Sheila, you're not the oldest person on the call. You're just the person with the longest record of dealing with the PMPRB issue. So that's
well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
But but I must say I remember those days too. Although it was just before I got involved. I got involved with PMPRB at an early stage. One of the things, and I think your final question is the right question. And it's one, quite frankly, that the PMPRB itself has known is the question and has been for a long time because of the way that the market and government policies have changed so dramatically in this area over the past 35 years. One thing I wanted to note from Durhan's comments and just generally on the question of mandate and role, I think the mandate has always been crystal clear. The problem is that too many stakeholders don't like that mandate and they want it to be different. And what I always found with the PMPRB was that we were constantly being challenged by the pharmaceutical industry saying, you're being too tough, you're not meant to do this, yada, yada. But even more so perhaps by advocates and then largely certain academics saying, well, no, we should have a system of government control, we should be regulating this, regulating that. But and this really culminated, I think, in a hearing in the industry committee in 1997, the 10-year review of Bill C-22, where it was clear that the politicians and the stakeholders were completely at odds about what the role of this organization, this agency should be, and what government policy should be. And of course, like many parliamentary committee reports, that didn't really lead to any change because there was no consensus on what the change should be. So PMPRB, I have a lot of sympathy for the PMPRB staff and the board because they're constantly being challenged to do more. And it's tough to say, no, that's not our job and we can't do it. What's happened in recent years is they've been responding to those pressures. And we've seen, and I won't go into the recent court cases, but the recent court cases have made it clear that by responding to those pressures, they've gone way too far. They've exceeded their legislative mandate, and as pointed out in a number of the cases, if they do have the authority to do some of the things they're doing, then it's probably not constitutional. And anyone who wants to have a quick overview of that, I recommend looking at the recent decision of the Federal Court of Appeal in the Election case. It just came down a couple of weeks ago. It's not that long, but it's excellent. It summarizes very clearly the precise role and responsibilities of the PMPRB and the dangers of going too far and beyond its authority. I know I don't want to take up other people's times, but if I may just add a point here on this, is that as a result of these recent activities of the board and what it's been doing, I think there is a real question today if this system is sustainable. Every action the PMPRB takes today, in light of its behavior and conduct and in light of these court decisions, everything it does is going to be challenged in the courts. And I don't see, in the Election case, my God, how long has Soliris been on the market? We still don't have a final decision on price. It's been over a decade. So this system is not fit for purpose, and it's time to make a major change.
We'll talk about a major change after we get through the scope and mandate question, because I think that's where, Durhan, you want to go. Like, this is your chance to have that steering committee where you can actually steer something potentially, Durhan. And and we're all on that bus, and we can take it where we want to go. So let's do that in a second. But first, Neil and then Declan. Neil, you're over to you.
Thanks, Bill. And so on this question, and forgive me if I jump ahead to a couple of the other questions because I know we're short on time, and I'll try and make this quick. And I was back with the very early days of PMPRB when we were developing guidelines, and the underlying premise of all the guidelines was that we always had to think about excessive in the context of patent abuse. That was the direction we were given when we were developing the initial guidelines back in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And as Wayne has well explained, that these things have morphed and gone well beyond that. And to see the Federal Court of Appeal decision bring it back to that, again, to the patent abuse, notion of patent abuse, I think is absolutely critical. So I think that's a really important piece in terms of where the mandate is. It needs to be informed by that. And I would suggest as well that when we look at the guidelines and where PMPRB is trying to go, it is now in an unresolvable, if that's a word, a situation where it cannot exercise its mandate properly, given the guidelines that they have. As Wayne has said, they're not fit for purpose. When we look at it in the context of the Federal Court of Appeal decision, and conclusions like the PMPRB may have helped itself to powers the statute has not given it, has misunderstood the mandate that has been provided by Parliament. When we look at the provisions of the guidelines, that's absolutely clear. If I could just quickly, Bill, move on to the proposed changes. And I'm going to focus primarily on the last one, on the gap medicines and grandfathered medicines and the impact. And the PMPRB's facts, when they finally came up, provided a little bit of insight into terms of impact. But if we think back, the original change to go to the highest international price for those probably reduced revenues to the pharmaceutical industry by $1 billion. So the initial change was $1 billion. If we look at what they're suggesting now to go to the median of the PMPRB 7, probably in the interim period before coming into force of the highest international price of the 11, probably extracts another $1 billion from the industry. These are really significant amounts. When we look at the total sales of patented medicines, probably $19–20 billion by the time we get to 2022. That's a significant amount of money being withdrawn, and that money goes towards things like research, goes towards patient support programs, goes towards employment, goes to all these things. And there is absolutely no discussion as to the rationale for doing this. There's the only wording in there is an appropriate response. Response to what? A response to whom? There's no rationale as to why this is necessary. And in my view, this comes back to, in a proper system, we would need a whole new RIAS and a whole going back to the regulation process, because no one has been consulted in a proper way on this. And I'll leave it at that. Back to you, Bill.
Thanks, Neil. And I just want to get to what Durhan put in the chat, and a couple people have too, exactly what the July 15 guideline changes recommend. They want to take on-market products. About 51% of them are priced above the median of the current comparator PMPRB 7. That means that the half are below or at the median and half are above or at the median. So if we take those 51% and crunch them down to the median, the middle of the PMPRB 7, I guess the question around mandated scope is everything above that middle price therefore excessive and an abuse of patent monopoly? And that's actually a good segue over to Declan and to Nicolas. I think I forget which one had your hand up first, but whoever takes their microphone off gets to go first. Over to you.
I think I was first, but that said, I'll try and keep it short as well. I mean, so first of all, thank you to Cord for organizing the panel today. It's really good to see some familiar faces, including Sheila. I haven't seen you in a very long time. Good to see you again. So I'd like to make a few initial non-legal points, which is, we're at a very interesting time in the history of the life sciences sector and the pharma industry in Canada. For many years, there was, I think, generally a lot of neglect of the industry, a lot of feelings that the industry was essentially a cost center and it needed to be controlled. And I think this played very much into the hands of those who wanted PMPRB to have a more expansive mandate than perhaps the Patent Act really allowed for. And they ran with that, and they ran with certain decisions, including the Celgene decision from the Supreme Court, which contained language around consumer protection, which in my view got completely stretched and spun. And now, as Wayne was saying, the Federal Court of Appeal has kind of put a cap in that and has actually said, you don't have a general consumer protection mandate. That's not what Celgene is about. But just getting to the present circumstances, we've got every single provincial and territorial government in Canada and the federal government all, falling over themselves to increase pharmaceutical capacity in Canada. We've got people, very interested in attracting pharma investments and clinical trials. People now see this as not just a nice to have, but it's a matter of public health. It's an imperative to have a successful and viable life sciences sector in the country. And a few weeks ago, of course, Health Canada and ISET came out with a biomanufacturing and life sciences policy. And Health Canada's in the process of bringing out an initiative with respect to drugs for rare diseases. And they're also streamlining regulations, trying to make them more efficient and take some learnings from the pandemic. So we have all these, mildly or strongly positive policy streams and initiatives. And yet we're still dealing with this multi-year train wreck of this attempted PMPRB reform, which is now mired in litigation in several different legal actions in different court systems. And this now seems completely outdated. And I think, history has kind of passed this reform by. And I think the first thing we can do, there is, I think, a good case to be made for a complete revisiting of PMPRB's jurisdiction. But job number one should be to stop these regulatory amendments immediately. And I think that would send a positive signal to the industry and other stakeholders that the government really is serious about a life sciences sector in Canada. Just going to the Federal Court of Appeal ruling, I think it does a few things which are, really quite positive. Number one, clearly the FCA has a narrower judicial understanding of PMPRB's jurisdiction than the board does. They express a real concern that the board is seeking to determine what is a reasonable price. And the FCA is not buying into that. The FCA is essentially saying that you need to have a jurisdiction which roots back to the Patent Act, because of course that's where the PMPRB derives its jurisdiction, and that it has to be about potential abuse of patents. We have a whole series of price regulators in Canada. When PMPRB was created, PCPA didn't exist. There were no product listing agreements. CADIF didn't exist. A huge infrastructure has been created in the past few decades, which I think has done maybe in some view a very effective, maybe too effective a job, for some people's liking in terms of controlling pricing. So it does beg the question, beyond that sort of original jurisdiction, which came about in the context of C-22, as Sheila mentioned, to act as a sort of a safeguard against patent abuse. What is the role of PMPRB, given the existence of all this other price control infrastructure that we already have in Canada, and which seems to be working pretty well? So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Declan. I know, Nicolas, you have a 2 o'clock hard stop. So please, your 2 cents. And then maybe the answer to Declan's question, which I'll put out to the panel, is Martin Shkreli in Canada. Is that what we're protecting against through the PMPRB? I don't know. That's a little bit potentially, I shouldn't mention that name. I forget what his old nickname was. Sheila will remember. Nicolas, over to you.
Wasn't it the Pharma Bro?
That's right. Thank you. Yeah, good job.
So so aside from this contribution, I guess others have said, I think a lot of what I was going to say. What I'll add, though, is that I think in thinking about whether the PMPRB has expanded its mandate over time, I think we have to understand what it was initially in the broader picture context. And so initially, it was really one small piece of the puzzle of this new regime meant to regulate medicine patents and bring more innovation to Canada. And I think Sheila mentioned that to an extent. And the issue was, how can monopolies really be used to stimulate Canadian-driven research innovation? And if you look at the legislative debates at the time, there was a lot of that. That was the goal. It was understood at the time that medicine prices might go up when monopolies were granted. That was part of the price to pay. And the PMPRB was created essentially as one player within that scheme to make sure that it didn't lead to patent abuses, right? That was the word that a couple of the panelists have mentioned. Whereas now, if you look at it, we're way past that regime, obviously, and price control has really become the central element of the PMPRB's mandate and also really of the government's medicine or patent medicine policy, right? There's no other price review boards for any other patented goods. The way we deal with patented medicines isn't with the usual focus on innovation as we do with other patents, but rather with a focus on price control. So that's, I think, where we are now. There's no doubt that the mandate of the PMPRB is currently at least interpreted as being very wide by the PMPRB. The question, I guess, is whether it has been responsible for expanding its mandate beyond its initial scope, or whether its mandate only really expanded because of these contextual factors, because the conception, I guess, was maybe well-intentioned initially, but completely changed in the new context of post-1993. And so just giving my 2 cents on the legal decisions that have come out. So Declan mentioned the Federal Court of Appeal ruling, which essentially takes the first answer to my question, who's responsible for this big mandate? And it says, oh, well, it's the PMPRB that's expanded its mandate. Excessive pricing isn't the same as reasonable pricing or affordable pricing. The PMPRB is only empowered to review prices for excessiveness, and the mandate therefore isn't fundamentally rotten or anything. It's just that it's improperly interpreted today. And I suppose a proper interpretation would be interpreting excessive pricing as patent abuses. So the other 2 decisions, the Quebec Superior Court decision and the Federal Court decision, which are the constitutional ones in which court is intervening on both appeals going up, that's sort of the flip side of it. The argument there was that, well, it's actually the mandate at the core that's rotten because it's shifted in response to the new contextual nature of our regime today. So the problem isn't the PMPRB. The PMPRB is applying its mandate, maybe expansively, but there's essentially no guidance provided to it as to how it should interpret its mandate. The word patent abuse doesn't appear in the legislation. It doesn't appear in the regulations. And furthermore, the government has as broad a discretion as you could possibly give to it to pass new regulations. And when it doesn't like the prices that are coming out, well, then it can impose a new basket of countries, and it can do that. So the PMPRB in that sense isn't really responsible for the prices. It's the government that's driving it and using the PMPRB for its purpose. What's the proper interpretation? I'm not sure, and I guess the courts will work it out in the long run. Whether that dictates what approach you have in terms of reforming it, maybe it does. Maybe the issue is just to a simple legislative tweak, and you've done it, you've managed to do it. Maybe there's a need for a more fundamental process and rethinking of how to integrate, I guess, the PMPRB with the purposes of innovation and patents and all of that. I don't know that I have the answers, but I suppose that's why we're having the conversation.
Well, and your different options that you put out there, Nicolas, I think might be a good sort of survey. We can't do that quickly, I don't think, on Zoom, but I think it would be good to put out to the cord community who've been educated on this, to one of the Louise on the chat group saying, this is so complex. How do we make this simple? But I would say that we've had so many webinars and good discussions like this. It's a mature issue. People are understanding what's at stake here. COVID has sharpened the mind, if nothing else. And that's where we are today. I want to shift the discussion to, okay, so what? Where are we going to go? I know, Sheila, you took your time earlier to say, we need a real strategy to figure out how Canada can do right by Canadians and get more R&D and have the conversations that you had in the late 80s. Neil, what can we do? Where are we going in terms of next steps, and then maybe Wayne or anyone else? What's the other fork in the road? What's the other path to potentially take that would actually solve this? Neil, over to you.
Okay, so yeah, I have to jump off in just a few minutes. I think the bottom line is that there needs to be a rethink on the whole PMPRB. Wayne said it's not fit for purpose. Nicolas, he's mentioned that this is going to take some time to work its way through the courts. And I would suggest the courts are not the place to develop policy on pricing in Canada. There needs to be a proper government policy that addresses that. And it may be stepping back and letting the PCPA, worry about pricing in Canada. So it's not appropriate to wait, for the courts, for this whole thing to play out through the courts with all the appeals and perhaps, eventually back up to the Supreme Court of Canada. This needs to be reworked sooner rather than later, because the uncertainty all this is causing to the pharma industry is a significant barrier to the introduction of new medicines. As long as this uncertainty persists, it's a real problem. And so there needs to be government action in terms of new policies very quickly. And that may mean getting rid of the PMPRB, or at least refocusing the PMPRB back to its original purpose. But we can't wait for the courts to work this all out. We'll be in the end of 2022 into 2023. And that uncertainty is just not acceptable. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Neil. And Declan, I know you got your hand up, but we're bumping up on 2 o'clock. I want to do a check with Durhan. Do you want to go a little bit longer? And Durhan, now that you've sort of heard from all the panelists, do you want to weigh in before I turn back to Declan, and if we take a bit longer?
Well, I think we've got the audience, so it's up to the audience, right? People can vote with their feet and leave if they want to. I think that's great. I think Louise did ask a critical question, and that is, how do we distill this down into something that we can put into, even a political platform, right? And what I'm hearing here is something that I had not really understood before. And I have to say, I've been sitting through all these webinars, and we've been caught up in all the minutia and the nuances. But what I'm hearing very strongly here from everybody is that the original rationale for the PMPRB in exchange for the patent protection and to encourage, investment in R&D, we don't need that any longer. What we do need, and I agree with Sheila, we need a robust strategy that says, let us make sure that we have an R&D strategy, and that where the prices and where they're going to be negotiated are actually with all the other bodies that we've got now. How good a job they're doing is a different question, but I did not walk into this thinking that, okay, we're going to kind of get rid of the PMPRB. I don't think anybody's ever heard me say it quite that boldly, but I think the refocusing might be that if we focus back to kind of where we were, that need is no longer there. So what is the need? And I would raise my hand to say we need a robust research and development strategy. We've been screaming that for the rare diseases. So I think this group for putting it so really, really strongly. So I would say that people need to leave, and I know some people do. If we can continue the conversation just a little bit longer. I see Isabella has her hand up, and Declan as well. So I'd be real keen to hear what others have said. And I thank Louise for kind of really hitting the nail on the head. What the heck are we saying to people? And maybe what we are saying is that the mandate is long gone, and that what we need is investment in R&D, not so much how we can keep the R&D out by putting in very stiff price controls.
Thanks, Durhan. So yeah, let's keep on going for a few more minutes. Declan, over to you, and then I see Isabel and Wayne can jump in.
So I agree with some of the statements that this is very complicated, and people have made a lot of money, including a lot of lawyers, as people have pointed out, with respect to this regime. But on one level, it's actually not that complicated, because in most jurisdictions, both in Canada and outside of Canada, there's a link between price control and access. Provincial governments in this country have a responsibility to their citizens to maintain the drug budget, but they also have a responsibility for access. One of the roots of the problem with PMPRB is that PMPRB has no access responsibility. And in fact, in the infamous steering committee meetings that Durhan alluded to earlier, they were quite clear about that. They laterally became more concerned about impact on access and said there was no impact on access when patient groups started to question them about the impact on access. But essentially, they're disconnected from the access continuum in a way that other institutions are not. Then they're also, to my knowledge, a uniquely Canadian phenomena. I have a hard time explaining to my international colleagues just what PMPRB is and why it exists. And therefore, that in and of itself acts as a bit of a disincentive because Canada has this unique institution. But over and above that, there always has to be this connection between access and pricing. And once you disintermediate that, I think you end up with strange policy results. And I think we're seeing a legacy of many years of that.
Thanks, Declan, for taking a crack at simplification. Isabel the Young, over to you.
Yeah, this is Khaled from Avir. We're a manufacturer and we focus a lot on niche drugs. A couple of things I just want to raise. The question you asked, Bill, is how do we go forward? Where do we go from here? One of the things I agree absolutely with Declan, PMPRB has no stake right now. Basically, they can go into long negotiations with you and they've got no pain at the end of the day. But more importantly, the PCPA, the CARAT and the NEST processes are allowed through pharma economics for the provinces to decide how much to pay for a drug. So essentially, no matter what the list price of a drug is, obviously not excessive, the bottom line is they're getting a rebate in order to move the product forward. And that's where they're forcing the pressure down on drugs. They are the payers, they're the ones who have to fork out this money. The second thing that I want to raise is, we often talk about the change of the comparator countries and put it under the carpet like it's not really important that they went from the 7 to 11. What really matters is they took the US out. Let's think for a second, the COVID vaccine, 3 of the 4 companies are US companies. What's the message you're sending to the US of A companies? We don't care about your prices. So we want an Apple iPad, but we don't want to pay the $1,000 an iPad that you can get across the border in the US. That doesn't make sense for the biotech industry. It just does not make sense that you're completely discounting the price of innovation to the country that's coming out with the innovation. And so that's I think, something that I don't know if we'll ever be able to go back, but I think is a very adverse event that happened. Including Australia and New Zealand is an absolute driver towards lowering the prices, because Australia and New Zealand are non-factors in developing new drugs. You're not going to get a new innovative medicine coming out of New Zealand towards Canada. So why are you including it in the basket is what I'm saying.
Yeah, just a quick precision on that. New Zealand's not being added to the basket, but Australia is. But one thing I will pick up there, and maybe a little shout out to our friends at CD Howe, just published a paper today to look at how to create a Canadian drug agency, a super agency that would include a lot of these elements. And I'm sure if we do part 2, we'll maybe try to get a chance to pull some of those thinkers out for that panel and discuss that. I feel like this is cross-country checkup. That's what it's starting to feel like when Isabel, who's not Isabel, phones in. But that's okay. Thank you so much. That was great. I think Wayne was next, and then Sheila.
Thanks, Bill. I'll try and be brief. I think when we talk about moving forward, what comes next, we need to remember that the kinds of changes we're talking about are not done with the stroke of a pen. The PMPRB is created by the Patent Act, and it would require significant changes to the Patent Act to expand or contract its mandate. So we need to be realistic about what's doable in the short term and then develop a goal for the long term. So I agree completely with Sheila's proposal that what we require is a national strategy on life sciences that incorporates pharmaceuticals. Other countries have done it. We're about the only one that hasn't since Bill C-22. And it's about time we did so. And I think that the way to do it is to say, look, the PMPRB situation is a mess. It's a mess in the courts, it's a mess in policy, it's divided stakeholders in a very negative way. Pause it, stop it, and let's do a complete reset of a life sciences strategy that incorporates the question of pricing and reimbursement, and decide how to proceed from there. So that's my immediate recommendation. Long term, Bill, you've pointed to C.D. Howe. A lot of people have been saying for many years, if we proceed with the Canada Drug Agency, that's the place to deal with pricing, because they would be involved in the purchasing. They would have skin in the game. So that's the place to do it. And even Doug Clark, the executive director of the PMPRB, said that in an interview last spring, that he sees that as the way of the future. So let's work on that. But we have to get there by going through the strategy development first.
Thanks, Wayne. Sheila, I don't know what we're doing for time. Should we give Sheila the last word or keep on going, Durhan? Are we?
I think we can give Sheila the last word. I think there's been great discussion on the chat line as well. So, you know, it was Sheila's fault that we got into this mess. I tossed it back into her lap.
Honestly, I wasn't that good back then, but thank you for the vote of confidence. Wayne, I just wanted to ask, which riding are you running in, and I'll try and figure out. You know, I think the bottom line, and I think Louise brought it up, right? And I have to debate a little bit on this notion of a Canada Drugs Agency. I don't think that's necessarily the place to go, because I think what worries me the most as a Canadian is if we don't get our act together and have a really strong life sciences strategy for Canada, we're already losing the battle. And I really challenged myself a couple of times to wonder whether or not it's too late already. But if Canada could figure out a way to maximize the potential that it has with the foundation, even if Canadians knew how great their researchers are and how terrific the healthcare system could be an advantage for the rest, for Canada to emerge as a world leader, the health economics resources that we have developed over the course of the last 35 years, incredible, like world class. But they're individual, and no one has been able to really pull them together and say, here's where Canada can really make a difference in the world. We got to stop focusing on Canada, like focus on where Canada can win in the world. And you know what? I got to say just the last word. The US is going to come down with government negotiating prices. Whether Canada negotiates prices or not, it's going to get completely overtaken. It's not big enough to negotiate. So I would just say the PCPA and all those things, the provinces have emerged. Prices are good in Canada. Durhan just showed it. It's working to protect Canadians. Now let's focus on what Canada can actually do to drive innovation and improve health overall and take a place in a world that it just doesn't have anymore. And it did. And that's disappointing for me. But anyways, thank you for having me. It's great to see everybody again. Always happy to see my fellow Canadians, and I'll look forward to watching the debate.
Sheila, watch out. I think there's going to be, if they could vote to nominate you to the Senate or to get you somehow to run up here, I think you would have secured a bit of support from the people on the line. So I just want to quickly sum up some of the things I saw in the chat group, Durhan, before we really close, because they provide some good ideas potentially for round two or part two. There was quite a lot of chatter on oversight and accountability. And I think that's something that we can put a circle on for a potential next discussion. And as part of that, it's how can patients actually be involved in anything that the PMPRB is doing, especially if somebody as vocal and clear and strong as you, Durhan, who sat on steering committees, you were frustrated, but that shouldn't be the case for patients who want to have their voices heard, and many of them are not as erudite or experienced or as strong as you. And this is just that I think is a big challenge that came out on the chat group. And the second one, and a couple of you brought it up, including Declan, how does the PMPRB fit in the context of a rare disease strategy, of a national pharmacare approach, of CADTH changes, this national formulary concept, an eventual Canadian drug agency? You know, these are all cogs in an already very complex machine that's often sequential in terms of how they regulate, review, negotiate, fund. And frankly, I can see some of the people on the delegation. People can sometimes feel like they are stuck in the cogs and even being churned out by them, as opposed to actually being a part of the system and leading to good results. And so maybe if nothing else, this what Declan called a train wreck could lead to something better. This is an opportunity. I'm always an optimist, and maybe it's not as optimistic as Sheila was saying, like, this is where we got to go. But I really do appreciate everyone on the line participating today. It's an amazing chat. Durhan, any other final thoughts? I mean, we are in the middle of an election, and that was a flag that Louise brought up. Why don't you quickly address that and then tell us what we're doing next?
Well, we're going to do part 2. And the question for us always, are we doing part 2 before the election or after the election? I think that's a really important question in terms of part 2. And we may do a little, put a little temperature out there to see what it is that we're going to do. I mean, this is not going to be the big election issue, but I'm actually cautioned by Catherine Boven's comment, said, can we really get rid of the PMPRB? Hey, think big, more important things have happened, and I think if we go back to recognizing that, I mean, I said Back to the Future, but, I think you guys have convinced me that, the original mandate really doesn't exist. And what we really need to do is to do what Sheila says, think bold. And I've been praising over and over again where the UK is going and what the NICE strategy is. How do we invite the pharmaceutical industry to come in and actually set up research and development? How do we partner with them? We cannot be afraid of public-private partnerships in order to move us forward. Can we reshift our thinking in terms of how do we, as you say, set up a robust pharmaceutical environment in Canada, as opposed to how do we drill way down in terms of having a minimalist environment that nobody wants to come into, which is going to serve patients better. Having a robust environment in which there's lots of research and development and innovation. And yes, we need to be aware of pricing and how that's going to affect it. But I keep saying, price of a drug is not the same thing as budget. And I think that's really, really important. And if we think about not paying for drugs, but investing in pharmaceuticals as part of our healthcare, it's a very different strategy. So I think we need to change that thinking around. So Catherine, I'm going to come back to you in terms of saying it isn't just getting rid of the PMPRB. It's really saying, how do we put something in place as a robust development strategy? And if they wither while we're building this up, and if they die on the vine because we're overshadowing them, then so be it. So maybe not spend so much energy in terms of how we chop them down as how we build something up that actually is going to be functional for Canada. So this has been, for me personally, a very exciting conversation, and much more than I would have ever anticipated. So my thanks again to Sheila for kind of starting this off, and to Wayne and to Neil for, kind of really helping us get back on track, and to everybody who contributed. I think, our next discussion, I think really should be, kind of engaging again with a broader, kind of, set of stakeholders, and really maybe the whole focus is, how do we build a robust, research and development strategy? So thank you so very much. And Bill, thank you as always for that masterful, don't forget to respond to the August 31st deadline in terms of the grandfather, gap in grandfather drugs. For me, the one simple answer is we should just get rid of it. There is no rationale for what they're doing. The timing is absolutely wrong. And, I wouldn't even nickel and dime in terms of why now and da-da-da-da. This is absolutely the wrong direction to be going into. And I think that's kind of important for us to put out there. No reason to be doing any of this right now. And in fact, it doesn't, So that to me would be my simple answer, but just, the same as all the others. So I don't have a more sophisticated answer to that, and maybe we can help articulate it better. But, I do think that we do need to respond to say, no way, not now, and maybe not ever.
Okay, well then, today's slides will be available on SlideShare and the webinar on YouTube. Thank you for everybody. Stay safe, be well, and come out to part 2. As you saw, we were able to see other people raise hands in the chat group, and honestly, a couple of you have been out. Wayne, you've been out at other webinars that Court has held, and so can't appreciate enough your expertise and your time, and we'll see everybody next time. Oh, Durhan.
Yes, one other comment. Sheila promised me a whole cast of characters that we can bring back in. So I'm going to be turning back to you. Like Back to the Future includes bringing in, some of those old timers, as you say, but also pairing them up with some of the people that have been chatting away. So we're going to come back to having maybe that debate all over again. And maybe the question is, if you were here now, and knowing what you do now, would you reintroduce a PMPRB?
Sounds like a game. No.
Thanks for having me. Now I'll just run away. But
Thanks a lot, folks.
all right, thanks everybody.